I am Dr. Jagtesh Kaur Gareva, Assistant Professor, Department of Art History and Visual Arts, Punjab University, Chandigarh. Today we are going to do Module 10, Eastern Indian Manuscript Painting. The module discusses Eastern Indian manuscript painting, also known as parlour painting. In this, the beginnings of the miniature painting tradition in the subcontinent are traced briefly. The tradition of Buddhist miniature painting from Eastern India and Nepal is discussed in detail, taking into account the time period, provenance, questions of dating, sources of style, themes and salient features. Citing examples, the issues are further discussed. Literary sources speak of the tradition of miniature painting from very early times. Faheim, the Chinese monk, records a flourishing Buddhist tradition of copying manuscripts in Tamluk in West Bengal as early as circa 400 AD. A practice that he states was not widespread, and he also goes on to mention that he drew images and pictures while he was at Tamluk. Buddhist tradition claims that writings of scriptures started at the time of Buddha, and Taranath, a 17th century Tibetan polymath, records the writing of scriptures began in earnest after the Third Council of Buddhism during the time of Kanishk I. The tradition of committing sacred texts to writing is traced to both Buddhism and Jainism, where these also became objects of worship. Buddhist writings from about the 5th century AD are found in the form of incised metal plates. Pratapaditya Pal dates the tradition of illumination in the subcontinent to the 7th century based on the earliest extant examples in the form of books on birch bark that had illustrated covers found in the stupas in Gilgit, Pakistan. Whereas Martin Lerner dates a painted book cover belonging to Eastern India to the 9th century AD, thus placing the practice of illustrating such works at least to this period. Now looking at the time period and the provenance, extant illustrated books from Buddhism come to us from the Palasena period, known as parlour paintings or Eastern Indian manuscript paintings. The earliest extant example of an illustrated manuscript dates from the early 11th century AD. The most creative phase of these Buddhist manuscript illuminations lasted only for 2 centuries, from circa 1000 to circa 1200 AD. The illuminated manuscripts, in order to be saved during the Muslim invasions, were carried by the monks to the Himalayan sanctuaries of Tibet and Nepal in the 12th and 13th centuries, where the manuscripts made in India were preserved for centuries. Pratapaditya Pal states that virtually all surviving manuscripts made in Eastern India date from the later parlour period, that is from the 10th through the 12th centuries, and that with the decline of Buddhism in India in the 13th century, the production of manuscripts, though considerably reduced, does not seem to have stopped, as these continued to be commissioned at least into the 15th century. Palm leaf manuscripts were prepared in Buddhist monasteries in Eastern India, such as at Nalanda, Vikramshila, Somapuri, as also in monasteries in South India, Deccan and Gujarat. The libraries in these monasteries had attached scriptoria where copying of manuscripts was carried out. The information regarding these works comes to us from the colophons that were appended usually on a separate folio in the manuscript, very often at the end and occasionally in the middle. These provide information on all or some of the following: patron, writer, illustrator, artist, provenance and date. A typical colophon, which is in the form of a verse, has the following pattern. 1. It declares the name of the donor, and a word or two might also be added to talk about his profession or status. The second line usually consists of a prayer to enlighten all beings. The name and regalia of the king and the place where the manuscript was copied might be mentioned, and lastly, the name of the specific monastery too is at times mentioned. Curiously, there is not one recorded colophon which has all the above mentioned information. The dating of these manuscripts is given with reference to the year of the reign of a Pala ruler, and this is counted from the year of accession. The issue of dating arises as firstly, there is more than one Pala ruler with the same name, such as 2 Mahipal and 3 Gopal. And secondly, in the case of many, the exact date of accession is not known. Thus, the dating of these manuscripts remains approximate, except in few cases where the regnal history of the ruler is known with certainty. The production of the manuscripts involved monks, professional scribes and artists who were in all probability retained by monasteries that contributed to the production of these manuscripts. The act of copying of books was an act of piety for scribes and artists and donors. Curiously enough, not a single manuscript bears the name of the artist who did the illustrations. Pratapadityapal states that it is not improbable that some of the scribes themselves were illuminators of these manuscripts. John Guy interprets the lack of artistic attribution as indicative of a hierarchy that placed the learned skill of writing above that of picture making. As these manuscripts are portable, thus in the case of a missing colophon, the provenance is at times difficult to ascertain, and this also leads to the issue of dating. A colophon placed at the end because of its place in the manuscript is also susceptible to damage, and in many instances the colophon folio is altogether missing. In such a case, according to S.K. Saraswati, as these manuscripts are written in a more or less consistent ornamental kutila which does not exhibit any substantial evolutionary changes, thus the style of painting is what provides the basis for chronology. Another very important source for dating the manuscripts is Nepal, that had a close alliance with Eastern India due to geographical proximity and, more importantly, due to shared religious beliefs. The Nepalese manuscripts have the advantage over the Eastern Indian manuscripts as they are dated. The surviving records from Nepal are dated slightly later than Eastern India, the earliest one being around 1015 AD, and are written in the Newari script, which interestingly is close to that of Kutila in Eastern India. The manuscripts found in Nepal or of Nepalese origin present the extension of the Eastern Indian style of miniature painting in that region and its growth there when the same was facing challenges in Eastern India. S.K. Saraswati additionally points out that these Nepalese manuscripts are a rich source for the study of Buddhist iconography and also for reconstructing Buddhist architecture or late medieval architecture that is generally part of the visual vocabulary of the works. Now we'll briefly look at the themes. With a few exceptions, the themes are Buddhist and the texts copied belong to the traditions of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. In fact, the colophons usually begin with a declaration that the book is a pious gift of giving the name of the follower of Mahayana Buddhism, and as the final phase of development of the Buddhist faith was the religious system called Vajrayana that flourished in Kashmir and Eastern India between the 8th and the 13th century AD, hence Vajrayana texts were also produced. Of the various texts that were copied by Buddhist followers, only a few were chosen to be illustrated. The two principal texts that were most frequently illuminated were the Ashta Sahasrika Prajna Paramita and Pancharaksha. The one that was the most revered and thus most copied was the Mahayana text Ashta Sahasrika Prajna Paramita, perfection of wisdom in 8,000 verses. The hearing, recitation, study and writing of the text was said to carry far more merit than the raising of stupas in honor of the master. The text also recommends that donating a copy is even more meritorious. As a result, copies of this were donated to monasteries. Also, as it was a philosophical text, it could be worshipped and recited by the monks. An 11th century frieze from Bodh Gaya, Bihar, very aptly captures the vigor with which such texts were venerated. As Prajna Paramita is essentially a work of pure metaphysics, the images in it are the deities of the Mahayana and Vajrayana pantheon and the 4 principal events and 4 miracles from the life of Buddha, all of which have little or no relation to the accompanying text. These narratives from Buddha's life are usually placed on the inside of wooden covers and the first or last folio of the manuscript, sometimes both. The Pancharaksha, the 5 protective charms, was also popular as apart from gaining spiritual merit from copying and donating it, the charms contained in it were also effective in keeping all spiritual and physical ills away. Consequently, the text was often kept in the house. The Pancharaksha is generally illuminated with 5 images of the 5 goddesses, which are the personification of the 5 charms, thus are directly related to the text, and at other times with images of the 5 transcendental Buddhas of the Vajrayana pantheon. John Guy brings forth a very rare occurrence of Ashtasahasrika Prajna Paramita, providing subject matter for narrative works as seen as this example on a wooden cover. Lastly, Dharani Sangraha, that is a collection of charms having a tantric affiliation, served the same purpose as Pancharaksha, but somehow was considered less potent and was consequently less popular. A Dharani Sangraha manuscript usually has formal representations of divine figures only. There is general agreement among scholars that the inclusion of images in the manuscripts was meant to enhance their transcendental potency and prolong their life, and also that as the book was worshipped, it also meant that the gods were being venerated. S.K. Saraswati also states that these images were made part of a text, at times even being unrelated to the text, as in case of Prajna Paramita, to enhance the ability of the follower to concentrate and meditate. These divine images were meant to be evoked through the recitation of Bij mantras or magical sound syllables. On the change in subject matter in Buddhist art, S.K. Saraswati is of the opinion that the close contact between Eastern India and Nepal, along with the nature of the texts, heralded a shift towards a more esoteric form of Buddhism, which in turn resulted in a shift to hieratic images of divinities such as bodhisattvas and taras of the Mahayana as well as Vajrayana school, rather than the narrative themes seen in earlier Buddhist art. It is clear from studies that when illustrations were employed, they followed a well thought out pattern of execution and were not just arbitrarily made a part of the manuscript. Now we'll generally look at the characteristics of these works. The material used for these early manuscripts was palm leaf, having lengths between 20 to 36 inches and an average width of about 2.5 to 3 inches. In these manuscripts, first the text was written in long, narrow areas of 5 to 6 lines interjected by oblong spaces, which were left blank for the painting to be executed. This order of execution is reinforced by the fact that the painting usually overlapped the script at the margins. There are instances where the scribe has in writing provided instructions for the painter, which seems to suggest distinct roles for both, though historians also hold the view that the monks in monasteries must have been fulfilling both roles. Each palm leaf was punched with 2 holes through which sutra or cotton thread was passed, which held the folios together, and the entire manuscript was usually placed between 2 protective wooden covers. Generally speaking, the folio had 3 panels of paintings, each measuring about 2.5 by 3 inches, 1 in the middle and 1 on each side, with fields of sacred text in between. There are instances where the painted panel appears only in the center of a folio. Additionally, in some later works, the area above and below the string holes is also illuminated by paintings in vertical registers. This area is decorated with images of stupas or divine figures. that are at times also found at the ends of the manuscript. Interestingly, we also come across pages that have further embellishments in the form of roundels or floral designs, but these additions were exclusive to the illuminated folios and were completely absent from the ones not illustrated. Art historian John Guy, though, is of the opinion that there is a change in dimensions of the manuscripts over time, even as the material continues to be palm leaf. According to him, in the 10th and 11th century, works tend to be narrow and longer, with 3 paintings inserted between the text and a folio, whereas in the early 12th century, the length of the folio reduces somewhat and the width increases, and there is 1 painting in the middle. He also states that in the early 12th century, both continued to be made. The wooden covers too are elaborated with paintings, uninterrupted by any text whatsoever. The paintings are unvaryingly on the inside and occasionally on the outside of the cover, and of the two, the former are better preserved. Pratapaditya Pal is of the opinion that even as the painted wooden covers are of great art historical value because of unconventional iconography and the lively compositions with which they are adorned, but the problem of dating these is compounded by the fact that they are not necessarily contemporaneous with the manuscripts. The fact that on a cover the space for painting is uninterrupted by text provides space for depiction of narrative scenes. Overall, the representations on the cover have more impact because of their conception being bolder, brighter and more spirited. In fact, Paul is of the opinion that some of the 12th century book covers have an unmatched charm even when compared to the inside folios. Now we'll briefly look at the sources of style. Taranath in his account mentions 2 artists, Dhiman and his son Bitpal from North Bengal, who were active during the times of kings Dharampal and Devpal. Described as artists of merit, they are said to have produced works in cast metal, sculpture and painting. The father founded the Eastern school and the son the Madhya Desh school, and the Nepalese school is said to resemble the Eastern school. S.K. Saraswati is of the view that the Eastern Indian manuscripts in the Pala period are perceptible forms of this Eastern school referred to, and that they are also the pictorial equivalents of the contemporary Pala sculptures in stone or metal. An analysis of the Eastern Indian miniature paintings points to beginnings in the painting tradition of Ajanta wall paintings during the Gupta period, with also an affiliation with the paintings at Bagh. But the paintings also display the impact of the medieval trend as evidenced by the loss of modelling capacity of line and colour, with greater emphasis on linearity. Despite this, the school does not show any major changes of style over the centuries. Pratapaditya Pal attributes this consistency of tradition spanning roughly over 2 centuries to the conservative nature of the artists who remained circumscribed by tradition, resulting in minimal stylistic changes or deviations over time. Elaborating further upon the sources of style, S.K. Saraswati states that though the Eastern Indian school of painting had its substratum presumably on the classical, it was not possible, however, to remain wholly unaffected by the medieval trend. The school felt the impact of the medieval but refused to be totally submerged by it. Throughout, there is an oscillation between the classical and the medieval. In fact, scholars such as S.K. Saraswati and Stella Crambrish are of the view that just as the medieval trend impacted the sculptural tradition, it is but natural that the painting tradition too got affected. but they also underline the fact that the strong classical foundations inherent in the miniature style never lost ground, and that rather the medieval elements were absorbed and made a part of the idiom, or at times the two were pitted against each other simultaneously in a work. This resulted in a constant oscillation between the classical and the medieval elements that continued throughout the course of the school. They further add that it is in the manuscripts from the 11th, 12th centuries, and especially work done during the rule of Ramapal, that one comes across such an oscillation, but here the medieval element is subordinated. John Guy also adds that the manuscript painting during Rampal's reign had reached very high standards of sophistication and subtlety. Later, from the reign of Gomindrapal, to whom historians assign the time at the close of the 12th century, the medieval elements begin to gain ascendancy. But interestingly, in this case as well, the classical element does not seem to be completely exhausted. Further, tracing the influences on Pal painting, historians link these to both painting and sculpture. John Guy is of the view that the paintings on the walls of Mahavihars from Kashmir to Bengal, of which we have accounts by pilgrims, though there are no extant remains, could have been a source of imagery. Also, such centers were the nucleus for the dissemination of religious and artistic knowledge and techniques. John Guy in this context refers to an illustrated book cover from Nepal dated to the 10th century depicting the Vesant Rajatak. In his view, the painting style in this embodies an Ajanta-esque pan-Indian style that links it to the lost, rich mural tradition of the monasteries. B.N. Goswami and John Guy emphasize the possibility that stelae or sculptures of that period, such as this one from Nalinda, Rajgir area, must have acted as a parent icon for understanding and replicating Buddhist narratives in stone, and quite possibly for palm leaf manuscript painting. John Guy also points out that temple sculptures with a detailed iconographic scheme and architectural elements such as niches housing sculptures would have inspired similar imagery in the paintings. Looking at some of the features of these works, the characteristic features of Eastern Indian miniature painting, even as they remain more or less the same, do show some evolution over time. To begin with, the compositions are simple and symmetrical, usually depicting the main figure in the center, hieratically scaled, and subsidiary figures on either side. However, with time, an elaboration in the compositions may be observed. The figures are generally well proportioned, though the artists animate them by exaggerating the posture, whether seated or standing, and at times contorting the standing pose into an S shape that Stella Kramrisch calls sickle shape. In some cases, in Bihar, the hands and feet are disproportionately large. At times, the soles are colored differently in order to distinguish them. The faces in Pala paintings are oval shaped with strongly pointed chins, whereas in paintings from Nepal, the faces are more perfectly round and the features are drawn with greater care in comparison to the Pala artists' freer rendering of features. The slight extension of the edges of the mouth and eyes also imparts a smiling expression. At times, when the face is shown in three-quarter view, there is visible a slight extension of the outline of the farther eye, which developed as a mannerism in Jain miniature painting. The background is usually indigo blue, and the depiction of scattered flowers is a device to show sacred space or divine presence. The seated central deity is shown against a cushion, at times patterned, and immediately behind is a nimbus or aureole. This device is effective in suggesting greater depth, even though the application of colors is flat, with the depiction of architectural elements or trees and foliage behind the figure. The illusion of depth is further enhanced. The color of the nimbus is generally used in contrast to the body color of the deity depicted. The use of contrasting colors adds to the definition of the outline and conveys a greater sense of volume to the figure or object. As all the gods and goddesses are depicted according to iconographic injunctions, therefore the complexion of the figure is determined by the iconography of the deity. Pratapaditya Pal points out that the colors reserved for complexions were usually restricted to yellow, red, green, blue or white. Yellow was specifically chosen for Buddha to represent the golden complexion. But we also come across works where a more naturalistic flesh color has been employed, attained by mixing brown, white with pink highlights. The attendants are usually painted in an array of colors. The robe for the Buddha is invariably red, but we come across deviations in color and patterning for other figures. The palette of the artist included primary colors such as white, yellow, blue, red and black. All these were obtained from minerals, ochres and a few other substances. White was used for priming, for highlights and as body color. Yellow has been employed to render complexion and body color of few figures. Blue has been used in various shades to give pleasing effects and was apparently extracted from indigo. Various shades of red, crude cinnabar, lac dye and red ochre are employed. The universal practice of using black too was retained and followed, especially in rendering the hair of the figures. Besides the set of primary colors, green is used for body color and its shades to depict foliage. Even as the paintings that are stylistically closer to the Ajanta tradition of painting show a degree of plastic conception through some tonal modeling and a model line, but with time the style becomes increasingly linear, with the lines becoming angular and brittle and color losing its modeling and being increasingly applied in a flat manner. Pratapaditya Pal proposes that some or all of these changes might also be a result of the varied talents of the artists and their capabilities to do justice to a specific subject matter. But it is not these factors alone that led to the exhaustion of the school. It was rather the conquest by Muslims at the close of the 12th century that hastened the closure of the school on Indian soil. It can be said with certainty that the Eastern Indian school was brought to Nepal, where it had impact on the art practices and survived for a few more centuries. But S.K. Saraswati is of the view that the Nepalese artists could never in their works revive or capture the spirit or momentum of the Eastern movement. Now we'll look at some examples of artworks. The development of the Eastern Indian manuscript painting is discussed below through specific examples. The first, 4 early painted folios from a Prajna Paramita manuscript. As the colophon folio is present, though damaged, it reveals the following information: that it was dedicated by Tajoka, wife of a scribe by the name of Sri Kumar, in the 27th regnal year of the king Mahipal. It has been dated to about circa 1025 AD. It was most likely copied in Bihar, a strong possibility in Nalanda. Pratapaditya Pal notes that the style of the script is close to that of engraved sculptures at Sarnath during the reign of Mahipal I and that the female figures too are reminiscent of a carved door frame found at Nalanda during Mahipal I's reign. The two central panels depict goddess Prajnaparamita and Bodhisattva Manjushri. The side panels depict the 8 great miracles from Buddha's life. The string holes have graceful figures of male and female serpent deities. Stylistically, there is a clear emphasis on correct proportion and modeling of forms. The control over line and subtle manipulations of the transparent garments, revealing the body underneath, along with grace in gestures and postures, all remind us of classical Ajanta murals. The next example, 2 folios from a Dharani Sangraha manuscript dated to circa 1075 from Bihar, Nalanda. The colophon reveals that it was dedicated by Ramjeev from Nepal and copied at Nalanda by the scribe Swameshwara. Pratapaditya Pal notes that this is the only known dedicated manuscript by a Buddhist from Nepal on a visit to Nalanda monastery. The folio has Prajnaparamita in the center with the scenes from the life of Buddha on either sides. The goddess in the center has her hands forming the gesture of turning the wheel of law, framed by lotuses supporting books on either side. The goddess in the center has her hands forming the gesture of turning the wheel of law, framed by lotuses supporting books on either side. The second folio again has scenes from the life of Buddha on either side, and the middle panel depicts a Bodhisattva, in all probability Manjushri, due to the gesture and complexion. The figure is seated in Maharaj Leela Asan with worshippers on either side. All the string holes in this case have stupa illustrations. The folios are also decorated with large roundels of lotus design interspersed between the text fields. The modelling as well as the brushwork in general are refined, and the ease associated with the style is intact. We can easily identify the conventions which are adhered to. Limited tonal modelling, flat washes to render figures, and controlled outline. Mention can also be made about the primary figures set against stark red aureole with hieratic scaling employed. There is also a slight elaboration in the compositions when compared to some older manuscripts. It would be interesting at this point to look at some manuscript covers from the time when Western Indian miniature painting was at its pinnacle. So this next example, 2 covers of a manuscript dated between 1075 and 1100 AD from Bihar. It is not clear to which manuscript these covers belong due to their unusual subject matter. On one cover, the inclusion of scenes from the life of Buddha suggests that it protected a Prajnaparamita manuscript. But these are not the usual 8 great miracles, which is unusual for book covers in India and Nepal. Whereas on the other cover, except from one figure on the right, in all probability Maitreya, 8 figures are of the Buddha. In case of the first cover, the narrative panels overall have an engaging air to them and are generally well executed. But we see deviations in 2 scenes which are relatively more elaborate. Buddha accepts rice cooked in milk from Sujata and the miracle at Urvila. Pratapaditya Pal and Julia Meek Pekarik place these covers stylistically in either the reign of Mahipal II or Rampal, and thus ascribe the particular time of 1075 to 1100. Overall, we see animation in the life scenes and greater expressive energy of interacting figures. The folio cover, the second one, is interesting from the iconography point of view. These figures exhibit various gestures of teaching and have a yellow complexion with a canopy of foliage above them. The figure on the right edge is Maitreya according to historians due to the Nagakeshara flower that it holds. The crowned figure on the extreme left also in all likelihood depicts Maitreya, but as a Buddha. Thus, this group of 7 Buddhas from the past and 2 Maitreyas is an uncommon grouping found in covers. The central figure of the Buddha is shown aligned on a straight axis, and its immobility is further heightened by the rhythm and the slightly angered postures of the other Buddhas. The patterning of the cushions and detail of nature add to the vigor of this work. The following example is from a folio, Ashta Sahasrika Prajnaparamita manuscript belonging to the early 12th century AD, either from Bengal or Bangladesh, and thus falling into the periods of impressive palm leaf manuscript illuminations. The enthroned figure is that of the Bodhisattva of compassion known as Avalokiteshvara. The figure is seated inside a temple shrine, which John Guy notes is of the Bhadra style superstructure of the Pala period. To impart importance, we see the elaboration in the form of detailed crown and the bejeweled figure being framed by 2 lotus flowers. The mudra is Vitarka mudra, and note how the female devotee looks up in bliss at the divine figure, much in agreement to the textual sources for such work, and goes on to show how the artist successfully develops a relation between the figures. John Guy notes that this recurring feature of developing a relation via gaze lies at the core of religious worship in India, and that it had by this time amalgamated with the Vajrayana world. He further adds that similar devices were employed at Ajanta to add coherence to figure groupings. Noteworthy is the delicacy in work employed to render the figures, nature and the inanimate objects, but importantly, it captures the apt emotion and psychological drama associated with the scene. According to historians, the presence of a stupa in the work embodies the presence of Buddha's relics and his teachings. The next folios are from a Prajnaparamita manuscript from Bihar, dated 1150 to 1200. The iconography of this manuscript is particularly rich, especially in case of the generously illustrated images of Vajrayana deities. Susan and John Huntington add that the esoteric tone and the rich iconography of late Pala manuscripts, such as these, played an integral role in influencing art practices in regions of Nepal and Tibet. The deities represented are identified as He Vajra, Vajravarahi, Vairochan, Amitayas, Ratnasambhav and unidentified Pala ruler. They further add that such esoteric images were much smaller in number when compared to the other more popular subjects, such as ones related to Buddha's life. Note how this manuscript follows the general later convention of one main illustration in the center with pictorial motifs painted around holes and ends of the pages. Interestingly, the 8 great miracles of Buddha's life are usually pushed to the margins or thus of lesser import, or at times the bands at the edges have decorative designs, stupas or divine figures. We observe rich detailing, energized or dynamic figures along with elaboration in design and increased animation overall. We close our discussion with an example of covers of a manuscript, probably a Dharani Sangraha, dated to about 1150 to 1200 AD. It is due to the majority of Vajrayana deities as part of this manuscript that historians infer that these might be the covers to a Dharani Sangraha manuscript. The main richness of these covers lies in the uninterrupted illustration of 18 deities in unusual postures, moods and iconography. Each of them occupies an identical shrine placed against primarily a red aureole and elaborate details. Further, one observes dense foliage and flowers peppered onto a dark blue background, all these adding to the depth and finesse of this manuscript. Deities having the most original composition and a vivacious air to them are flanked by attendant figures in front of the shrines. These attendants too are shown in various moods such as dancing, scared, cheering, etc. Thus, we can safely conclude that the artist has been extremely imaginative in his conception and exhibits great talent. The colors are juxtaposed and balanced in such a way that they complement the overall vibrancy, while the compositions become more complex than its predecessors. We can easily compare this example with the previously discussed example to observe how far the painting style has evolved in terms of book cover illumination in particular and manuscript illumination in general. We can easily compare this example with the previously discussed example to observe how far the painting style has evolved in terms of book cover illumination in particular and manuscript illumination in general.